Once again, my name is Johnny Malpica, and I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach for EJB Designs. Welcome to our second annual Urban Design Lecture Series, The Places People Make. A quick thank you to some of our sponsors, New Jersey APA, of course, the Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy, Arctober, the Project for Public Spaces, and of course, the Rutgers Graduate Student Association. So during this lecture, please be advised that we will be recording the entire lecture for release. So if you don't want to be seen on the screen, please just make sure that you turn your camera off. We'll have a Q&A after the presentation. So throughout the presentation, please write down all of the questions that you might have. We'll be utilizing the chat feature to do so. And so you can drop your questions in the chat and I will ask them for you, or I will call upon you to ask them. We will be letting you ask your questions in the order that they are received to be fair to all our participants. And at the end of this lecture, you will receive a follow-up email from myself, and I will send you information on receiving the recorded lecture once we do release it, which should be this weekend.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second annual Urban Design Lecture Series, The Places People Make. My name is Jasmine Grossman, and I'm a second-year MCRP student with a concentration in urban design, redevelopment and rehabilitation, and transportation planning. I also serve as the president of EJB Designs. EJB Designs is a student organization at the Bloustein School that utilizes drawing to educate students in innovative graphic negotiation skills. EJB Designs began as a group of planning students and faculty seeking to improve their hand-drawing skills and digital graphic methods. This group of students evolved into an organization that aims to reestablish the core values at the foundation of hand drawing, the value of which is often overlooked throughout the planning process. We hold events and bi-weekly drawing sessions throughout the school year to help develop leaders and highly skilled designers who engage in drawing, rendering, and computer generation. Through practice and social networking, our organization's members prepare to break out into the professional world as confident and innovative urban designers and planners. On behalf of the EJB Designs team, I thank you all for joining us for this important discussion today about public spaces and the public realm.
Good afternoon. My name is Justin Alexander, and I am a junior in the undergraduate Urban Planning and Design program and the secretary of EJB Designs. The Urban Design Lecture Series is hosted annually by EJB Designs. This event seeks to create awareness of development issues affecting our civic unity by forming a discussion around an integral concept to urbanism, community. Today, for our second annual lecture series, we examine the impact of public spaces on our changing communities 50 years after William H. Whyte's pioneering study of New York City's urban life. In our first lecture series last year, we opened a discussion about the goals of urban design and its ultimate impact on communities. We specifically focused on the influence that design has on providing equitable access to quality living into various areas of a city or place. Urban design is often used to generate designed value, and it is used to substantiate citizen buy-in, promising a better quality of life, a stronger tax base, and more opportunities. But for whom is value designed? Extending this question about design's impact on community, this lecture series focuses on the design and influence of public spaces in our communities. Today, we honor the legacy of William Whyte's significant contribution to our profession. His study of human behavior and newly developed public open spaces helped bring awareness and discussion of the issue of design and the resulting use of public space. He discovered successful and unsuccessful places. The findings revealed human adaptations to these spaces, which were often built without intention. The spaces he observed were simply complying with city incentives to build more public spaces in the city. The study helped us see how evidence-based information can inform design ideas with anticipated benefits to our citizens.
This was 50 years ago. Today, our design of public spaces reflects the impacts of our dependence on explicitly designed value. This has come at the expense of the interests and needs of the residents of American cities. The polarization of community and wealth brings into question how the public realm can play a greater role in reaching the heart of diverse communities, the intentions of new development in public spaces. How do planners and decision makers respond to this failure that has deprived communities of their right to the public realm? And can the sociability of public space correct these deficiencies in our built environment? Similar to Whyte's discovery over 4 decades ago, the sociability of public spaces is telling us something. We are now confronted by a confluence of catastrophes: the COVID-19 pandemic, economic collapse, persistence of police brutality, the erosion of civil rights, further threats to reproductive and LGBTQ+ rights in the future, and a looming election, all while we reckon with the existential threat of climate change. These issues that affect all of us, whether directly or indirectly, and they must be addressed not by individuals, but by collective groups. In the streets of our neighborhoods, across bridges between communities, and on the steps of City Hall, there is more to public spaces in a city or place than just randomly distributed spaces. The design of the public realm brings new promise to our social environment, and it is open to a significant study on human behavior. We are interested in knowing more about the inaccessibility and hostility of the public realm for some city residents. We have found new evidence of flawed design through our own projects at the Bloustein School, which threatens the fair use of public spaces for all.
We seek to explore and learn more about the impacts of explicitly designed value on access to the public realm. What we can take away from this discussion is an understanding of how we approach the design of our public spaces. What we, as practitioners and scholars in the field, must be cognizant of is how we may put people before value to achieve more equitable public spaces.
And with that said, I'm going to begin formally introducing our speaker. Good evening once again. My name is Johnny Malpica, Director of Communications and Outreach. Tonight, we are very pleased to have with us Professor Charles T. Brown as our featured returning speaker for the second time in this year's annual Urban Design Lecture Series. Professor Brown is an expert in the intersection of transportation, health, and equity. He is a national voice in encouraging transportation equity through authentic public outreach and engagement. He currently oversees the New Jersey Bicycle and Pedestrian Resource Center on behalf of the New Jersey Department of Transportation and has taught introductory and advanced level courses on environmental justice for the National Transit Institute, the Federal Transit Authority, and the Federal Housing Administration. Professor Brown is a member of the course faculty in the Walkability Action Institute, funded by the Center for Disease Control, and has served as an instructor for 30 deliveries of the New Jersey Department of Transportation's Complete Street course. He is a member of the board of directors with America Walks, as well as a member of the Pedestrian Safety Committee and Bicycle Transportation Committee of the Transportation Research Board. Professor Brown is an extremely accomplished professional professor and researcher. However, tonight, he is not speaking to us as Professor Brown, but rather as Charles T. Brown. He is off the clock. His views and opinions are entirely his own and are not endorsed in any way by any institution that he is affiliated with. And with that said, on behalf of my fellow e-board members and faculty advisors of EJB Designs, please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Professor Charles T. Brown.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you to the entire team. As stated, my name is Charles T. Brown, and it is an absolute honor to be here with you today. I would like to start by thanking APA, Project for Public Spaces, the Center for Architecture, Archtober, Professor Juan, Professor Barbara, Mr. Paul Drake, and my colleagues and peers at the Voorhees Transportation Center. I would also like to start with the land acknowledgement for the Lenni Lenape people who once had ownership and control of this land. I certainly want to make sure I acknowledge them. I am completely honored, excited to share with you all today my assertion of arrested mobility. And I look forward to engaging with hopefully some lively Q&A afterwards. So the title of my presentation today is Arrested Mobility, exploring the adverse social, political, economic, and health outcomes of over-policing Black mobility in the US. It is important, though, before I start, that I show you a picture of how handsome I used to be. Really, I'm showing you this picture to show you how well I was able to coordinate with my teddy bear. But truthfully, I'm showing you this because I want to self-identify as a street-level researcher and as a pracademic. I am affectionately known in many circles as a pracademic, given my combined professional experience as a private and public sector transportation planner and more than a decade of experience working within and with academic institutions from around the country. I want to briefly pause because I hear some kind of background noise. Everyone, please make sure you mute it. Similarly, I am unapologetically a street-level researcher because I strongly believe the solutions to and answers to many of societal problems lie with the people, those in the literal streets. Therefore, it is imperative that we, the so-called experts, move from behind our computers and get out and interact with the people. And by people, I really do mean all people. So many will ask, Mr. Brown, why focus on race, ethnicity at the intersection of transportation, health, and equity? Well, I have chosen to prioritize the race conversation in my transportation equity work in order to broaden the narrative of transportation planning. I am strongly committed to leading and centering race in all transportation decision-making processes because too often, as many of you know, race is glazed over in planning, research, and policy development that makes assumptions about the communities we are tasked to serve. Instead, what you find is that proxies such as income, age, sex, gender, education, and even access to a vehicle are used as an alternative to avoid centering race-based issues. And if you've been paying attention, you know that the history of structural racism, the public policies, the institutional practices, and the social norms that together maintain this racial hierarchy and its impact across the country and within communities is often overlooked and unacknowledged, yet it is pervasive and unmistakably harmful to everyone. And so as planners, we have a professional and a moral obligation to acknowledge that the uneven development of our cities and the resulting racial health and wealth disparities are the result of systemic racism ingrained within the planning profession, as well as the engineering profession, the architecture profession, real estate, and et cetera. Pick one. But you can't talk about race and ethnicity in transportation without talking about equity. So what is equity? Equity involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives. I've given that statement across the country, and most people don't push back when you state this as a simple definition for equity. But as you all know, equity is much more complex than that. Equity is also the presence of justice and fairness within the procedures, the processes, and the distribution of resources by institutions or systems. If you were to ask my Southern mother what is equity or how to seek equity, she would tell you follow the money. She understands, as I hope you all understand, that facing equity issues then require an understanding of the underlying or the root causes of inequalities and oppression within our society. But you can't stop there. I'm going to ask that you go further and you consider the role that social identities play within the conversation about equity as well. And while doing so, I would like for you to ask yourself these questions. First and foremost, which identities do you think about most often? Which identities do you think about least often? Which of your own identities would you like to learn more about? Which of your identities have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself? Which of your identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? We're all being honest here. When I answer the majority of those questions, the first thing that comes to mind is my race. I'm going to take you through an exercise here because I think it's important to prep you for not what is seen, but what is unseen. For those of you who've been in my studio or who have gone through this exercise, I ask that you not comment. But those of you who have not gone through the exercise, I ask that you participate via the chat. This is the West Ward of Newark, New Jersey. It is a majority Black community, a low-income community, and I was proud to serve as a board member with the Urban League of Essex County. We were working hand in hand trying to bring this community back to life through investments, through housing, through infrastructure, etc. I usually start my studios by asking my graduate students, what changes would you like to see present here in this photo? I would like for you to do the same now. Please type in the chat what changes you would like to see. I'll be watching the chat, but as you can imagine, you're going to hear people say things such as improve the sidewalk, add pedestrian street lighting, add trees, add benches, address the blight in the community. Where are the bicycle lanes? Where's the additional greenery? Where's the housing? Where's the commercial spaces? What you don't hear 9 out of 10 people say is where are the people? That is important because when we met with the community, that's the first thing that the community said. Today, we are a majority Black community. Tomorrow, we want to be a majority Black community. We don't mind the bike lanes. We don't mind the infrastructure changes that transportation planners, architects, et cetera, are bringing to us. We just don't want to be erased from the future. And so when you hear people talk about bike lanes being white lanes or bike lanes leading to gentrification, there is some merit in that. But please know the real issue is the fact that you've done a before and after rendering, and you've showed the very people that are living there that they won't be present in the future. And so that leads to a quote I've made and a quote I continue to stand by. Transportation, our profession, has been weaponized as a tool of oppression within society. And of course, I wouldn't make that statement without showing you evidence. It starts with the highway robberies that took place across the United States. In fact, you can find or track any highway system across the US, and you're more likely to find examples of it destroying many Black and brown communities, many of which were thriving. We're also coming to learn or find out, due to evidence, the connection between transportation and climate change. I was both fortunate and unfortunate to witness and survive both Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 and Hurricane Sandy in 2012. If you're wondering, no, hurricanes do not follow me. But it doesn't stop there. There are also impacts, or we should say traffic violence. When we look at vehicle and pedestrian crashes across this country and who's at risk, we find that it's older adults, people of color, and people walking in low-income communities. When we look at older adults, those with a relative pedestrian danger index, their relative pedestrian danger index is more than a third higher than the general population. When we look at people of color, during this time frame between 2008 and 2017, Black and African Americans were 72% more likely to have been struck and killed by drivers while walking. And then we would look at low-income communities, those making $36,000 or less. They were killed at a much higher rate. Why is this important? This is important because you may not identify as a person aged 50 or older. You may not identify as a Black American or a Black Indigenous person of color, but you may find yourself traversing through, or your friends or family members traversing through a low-income community, which means that at a bare minimum, you should have some empathy for these communities. And I've been fortunate enough to work across the country with the public health sector. They're starting to address or understand that the issues that we're facing are not just based solely on risky behaviors. Historically, what they've done was start at your risky behavior. They would ask you, have you been smoking, experiencing low physical activity, violence, alcohols and drugs, then tell you about how that leads to disease and injury and mortality. Thankfully, as we've pushed back, now they're starting to see that one's living condition actually impacts one's risk behavior. Institutional inequities impact living conditions, and then social inequities with its bidirectional relationship with institutional inequities lead to the living conditions that lead to the risk behaviors that lead to disease and injury, and then mortality. But it doesn't stop there. Here's a photo of Seattle, or a map of Seattle. Seattle is by far one of the most diverse cities in all of America. It is also recognized as one of the most progressive in terms of bicycle, pedestrian, urban design, etc. You name it, Seattle is usually at the top of the list. But I want you to pay attention to what this map says. Type this in the chat as well. If white is represented by blue on this map, green represents Black, purple represents Hispanic, and the Asian community is represented by some of the peachy colors here, what do you see? Maybe it's hard to see in Seattle. Let me take you to Tampa Bay. If blue represents where most of the white people live, if green represents where the Black people live, purple represents where the Hispanics live, what do you see in Tampa Bay? It's not fair to pick on Tampa, so let's go to Detroit. This is by far the Blackest city in America. But if that is true, and if blue represents where white people live, green represents where Blacks live, purple represents where Hispanics live, what do you see? We're not just going to pick on Detroit either. We're going to go to Houston, Texas, the 5th largest city in America. And if blue represents where white live, green represents where Black live, purple represents where Hispanics live, what do you see in Houston? Of course, we're not going to pick on Houston. We're going to go to Atlanta, the Black Mecca. And if blue represents where white lives, green represents where Blacks live, what do you see in Atlanta? Now, most of you would say, oh, we expected to see it in those places if you know what that thing is. Well, let's go to the nation's capital. If blue represents where whites live, green represents where Blacks live, what do you see in Washington, D.C.? So many of you at this point will say, what about diverse places such as Seattle? Well, let's go to one of the most diverse places in all of the United States, if not the world, New York City. If blue represents where white people live, green represents where Blacks live, purple represents where Hispanics live, what do you see in New York City? By now, many of you are starting to say racial, residential segregation. I hope that you add by design to that statement. How do I know it's by design? Because most people ask at this point, is there an exception to this pattern that you've shown? Of course there is. Go to Portland, Oregon. Because if blue represents where white people live, green represents where Black live, purple Hispanics, what do you see in Portland, Oregon? What you see is a system that intentionally, by design, segregates us. So what are the equity implications of such then? Well, we're starting to find that one's race determines one's place, which determines one's health. And so as we become more serious about this, what we understand then is that history doesn't say goodbye. History says, see you later. And the later, unfortunately, is now. So as we have this conversation about public space, active transportation, transportation and mobility in general, we have to contextualize the conversation because there are a plethora of federal, state, and local, as well as regional initiatives, plans, programs, et cetera, aimed at increasing the mobility and physical activity of Black, Indigenous people of color across this country, including the CDC. The CDC has a goal to help 27 million people become more physically active by 2027, with the understanding that physical activity can improve their health, their quality of life, and reduce healthcare. The problem with CDC's initiative, the problem with urban planning, architecture, real estate, engineering, et cetera, is this. It is ahistorical in that it does not acknowledge the history of systemic and institutional racism within the United States. Secondly, the strategies do not highlight the role of state and municipal law enforcement in discouraging and denying physical activity among Black, Indigenous people of color. The sort of equitable and inclusive access that is talked about is limited as a foundational element in most of the plans and programs, but not explicitly listed or stated as a desired outcome or goal with a tangible organizational commitment to funding organizations that work with and in Black and other BIPOC communities. Fourth, there is no mention of the overwhelming data highlighting the magnitude of unconscious bias in the criminalization of Blackness in America, particularly in light of the current climate. And fifth, the strategies do not specifically discuss the need for institutional changes, particularly around increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only internally, but externally as well. And so given this, we framed it social determinants of health, but it's actually political determinants of health. And what I want to bring the attention to everyone around is the need to understand that it is time to pause. Why is it time to pause? Well, if you would allow me, I would love to, at this moment, arrest your consciousness. I want to arrest your consciousness so that we do not continue to perpetuate and do the things that we've done for many years in getting the same results. But in arresting your consciousness, I want to present to you an assertion that I have, which is arrested mobility. Arrested mobility is the assertion that Black people and other minorities have been historically and presently denied by legal and illegal authority the inalienable right to move, to be moved, or to simply exist in public space. This results in adverse social, political, economic, and health effects that are widespread and intergenerational, and preventable. So as shown here, arrested mobility is a direct manifestation across 4 distinct realms. The first one is the personal realm of racism, interpersonal realm of racism, institutional realm of racism, and the cultural realm of racism. These collective realms of racism have resulted in the social construct of race, both locally and globally, and have thus led to the intentional and deliberate targeting and over-policing of Black and brown people in terms of their physical mobility directly and their social mobility indirectly. So for all of the social scientists and others here present, please note that I understand that the direct relationship between the variables shown here are more complex and nuanced than displayed. And so how then does over-policing happens, you may say? Well, over-policing is evident via 3 distinct ways. First is policy. Policy in terms of zoning, residential segregation, policy that resulted in sundown towns, disinvestment, etc. You're familiar with as planners the policies that may or may not lead to Black and brown people's mobility being arrested. The second form of over-policing happens via the self-deputization of non-Hispanic white citizens in this country. That is more commonly known as today as the Karens, those who take it upon themselves to police or over-police the movement of Black and brown bodies in this country. And then the third way, of course, is the most known way. It happens via law enforcement at the federal, state, and local levels. So those are the 3 Ps, policy, and policing is how it happens. And so then, how does it happen, you may ask, across the different modalities? Well, the research that I'm going to show you here shortly states that it happens regardless of age. There are cases in which those as young as 3 are being over-policed, whether it's biking in their neighborhoods, biking at the park, or simply taking a ride on their father's neck. So then the most logical question becomes, is there evidence to support arrested mobility across these different modes of transportation? Well, let's see. Let's start with walking. The most recent and notable cases of over-policing Black mobility via walking or running in the US include the shooting deaths and killings of Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging, Trayvon Martin, who was walking, and Mike Brown, who was also walking. Both Ahmaud Arbery as well as Trayvon Martin were killed by self-deputized non-Hispanic white citizens, and Mike was killed by law enforcement. Correction, Trayvon may have been killed by a Hispanic white citizen. When it comes to the data, what we find is that an analysis of 5 years of tickets showed that in Biking While Black in the Jacksonville study, that 55% of the tickets were issued to Black individuals, even though only 29% of the population identified as Black. In that same study, Blacks were 3 times more likely to receive a ticket than were whites. Also, residents of the city's 3 poorest zip codes were about 6 times as likely to receive a pedestrian citation. Then when we move to Atlanta, there's a case of Raquel Nelson, a Black single mother and college student who lost her son in a hit and run while crossing the street to her apartment. She was found guilty by an all-white jury of reckless conduct, improperly crossing a roadway, and second-degree murder or homicide. The man who killed her son was later found and admitted to drinking and taking painkillers on the night he killed her son. I wish, though, arrested mobility stopped there. It does not. Now let's look at bicycling or cycling. There are more than a dozen studies and reports of over-policing Black mobility via bicycling in the US. I've been fortunate enough to do research on this, so even some of my own research studies touch on this. But one of the most notable and recent studies or news articles on the topic of Biking While Black happened in Chicago, and it was done by the Chicago Tribune, which found that not a single majority white area ranked in the top 10 for bicycle tickets, despite how popular bicycling is in the whitest areas of Chicago. Other notable studies out of Tampa, Oakland, et cetera, show the disparities in over-policing the mobility of Black and brown populations. So let's go over some of that. Let's start with Austin, Texas. In Austin, Texas, twice as many bicycle citations are written in majority Black neighborhoods than in majority white or Latino neighborhoods. In fact, in one study, 321 bicycle tickets were issued in a majority low-income Black community, whereas only 5 were issued in a majority wealthy white community. That is 321 tickets versus 5. And as we all know, the majority of the people that are presently biking in Austin are not those living in the Black communities, but those living elsewhere. Also in Tampa, between 2003 to 2015, Tampa police issued over 10,000 tickets. 79% of those tickets were issued to African Americans. They make up only 26% of the population. We also know that during that sort of 12-year period that was studied, at least 142 tickets were issued to kids aged 15 and under, including children as young as 3. And then lastly, in Oakland, California, 60% of all bicycle stops were of Black cyclists, followed by Hispanics and whites. 60%. The city of Oakland's population in terms of Blackness is only 25%. I wish arrested mobility would stop there, but it doesn't. It also manifests itself in public transit. In the most recent and notable case of over-policing Black mobility in public transit includes the murder or the killing of Oscar Grant III, who was a 22-year-old young man, African-American man, who was killed by BART police officers in Oakland. What does the data say? Well, a Marshall Project analysis of New York Division of Criminal Justice Service data from 2014 showed that while the number of turnstile arrests have decreased significantly, what has not changed is who gets arrested. 89% of those arrested are Black or Hispanic, virtually the same proportion since 2014. Within that same study, they found that the top 10 neighborhoods in New York with the highest number of arrests per subway strike were all predominantly Black or Hispanic. And then in New York City, Adrian Napier, a Black teenager, was tackled and aimed at by 10 police officers for fare evasion, with guns, of course. The fare evasion was only $2.75. And then as we go to Portland, we find out that in 2017, African Americans were 8 times as likely as whites to be charged for certain transit violations in that city. Thankfully, that has since been decriminalized. I wish it would stop there. However, it doesn't. It goes into driving as well. And the most recent and notable cases of over-policing Black mobility via driving in the US includes the killings of Philando Castile and the Queen Sandra Bland. What does the data say? Well, a nationwide analysis of police trends and traffic stops show that Blacks and Hispanics are disproportionately stopped to white drivers, even though the hit rate of white and Black drivers are similar, while that of Hispanic drivers is lower. They also found, interestingly, that police are less likely to pull over Black drivers after dusk when the race of the driver is less obvious to police. And then in Minnesota or Minneapolis, which has been the sort of epicenter of a lot of what's happening in society, a state commission study there found that African Americans and Latinos were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police in majority white neighborhoods. They also found that 47% of the arrests made by that department were Black individuals, even though the patrolled area is only 7% Black. I wish I could stop there, but it doesn't. It also goes into ride sharing. And one of the most notable stories about ride sharing involved researchers from Stanford, MIT, and the University of Washington, who found that ride share drivers discriminate based on race and gender. So in some of the data or some of the stories here of the 581 app hailing trips recorded, African American travelers waited on average 20% longer than white travelers to have their rides accepted on Lyft or Uber. It also took about 30% longer for the African American travelers to be picked up than the white travelers when they used these apps. One of the scary things about this too is that female travelers were driven 5% further than males given the same start and finish location. And then 55% of the Blacks who call for a cab at some point have experienced a refusal by the service to send a cab to their community. And so sometimes when I say arrested mobility, I mean the arrested part literally. I wish though I could stop at ride sharing. I cannot. Because then we'd find that our mobility is arrested and our lives are taken, even when we're just sleeping in our own homes or being a kid playing in our yards or in our parks, such as Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice. So then the most logical question now is, what are then the social, the political, the economic, and the health outcomes of this over-policing? I'll briefly run through this because I would like to end with some strategies that you can use to hopefully mitigate or eradicate these instances. Here are some stats. We know that Blacks are 54% less likely to be physically active than whites, regardless of neighborhood or individual income level. So no, you cannot earn your way out of the discrimination. Blacks are also 46% less likely to be physically active than whites, regardless of the racial composition of the neighborhood. No, as a Black person, you cannot move your way out of the discrimination. We also learned that Black men living in predominantly white neighborhoods were far less likely to engage in physical activity in the areas surrounding their own homes. And I can tell you personally, this last bullet resonates, that no matter where I am, no matter how much money I make, I still attempt to make myself seem less threatening, which was also one of the findings in one of the recent research articles that I looked at. But they don't stop there. Other impacts include findings that areas with a larger African-American population tend to have lower rates of upward mobility. This goes back to what I said earlier. Arrested mobility is about arresting one's physical mobility first, which leads to the arresting of one's upward mobility. There's also findings that show that rideshare fares tend to be higher for drop-offs in Chicago neighborhoods with high non-white populations. The data shows that Black African Americans are more likely to be uninsured than white Americans. It shows that racial residential segregation has led to a dearth of hospitals and healthcare providers in majority Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And then it also shows that Black African Americans are disproportionately associated with food deserts, made even worse by lack of access to transportation options. We also know from an economic standpoint that Black Americans' average household income is 60% that of white households, and they are paid less than whites for the same jobs. And then lastly, we know that they have less access to reliable transportation, but this has a political impact because it makes them vulnerable to disenfranchisement efforts like lower density of polling places, which then exacerbates the lack of representation in government. So you may ask, what are some strategies? I could not give you this presentation without giving you a series of strategies to address these issues. But before I do that, I want to give you some tools, some very important justice tools or frameworks to consider. These justice tools or frameworks include distributive justice, procedural justice, interactional justice, representational justice, and care. No matter what project you are doing, you should be seeking that justice is present via these means. The first question you must ask is, in terms of distributive justice, who has physical access to the street, the park, the trail, or the public space? If you're designing without the who in mind, what's the point? And when you ask the who question, you must take a look at the race and the ethnicity, the income status of those who may potentially have access to your site. But the who or the what also considers the different modalities. Are you providing access only to cars? Or are you providing it to pedestrians, bicyclists, and others? This is important because some of my research from Rutgers showed that when we ask parents, particularly minority parents, if they feel safe, if they feel comfortable allowing their children to bicycle in their neighborhoods, 54% of the respondents do not feel that their children are safe from traffic when bicycling in their neighborhood. And then we also found that nearly 1 in 4 feel that they can safely bicycle to local parks or trails from their homes. I make this point because proximity isn't access. There are many who would say there are bicycle lane, bicycle trails, and parks and plaza that are present in these Black and brown spaces, but proximity is not access. You must also talk about or ask the question in terms of procedural justice, who has influence over the design, the operation, and the programming of a space? This is important because minority youth are not included in planning and transportation decision-making processes. If you don't believe me, look around. Then you must ask about interactional justice. What makes people feel welcomed or unwanted in a space? You know by now, or maybe you do not, that African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. And when it comes to gender differences, the males reported being stopped at a rate 7 times that than females. But it doesn't end there. We also want representational justice as well, especially in the planning of public spaces and urban design, because people must feel that their experiences and their history is represented in a space. We started our presentation with a land acknowledgement. We wanted to honor the space and the history of that space because too often historical and cultural erasure takes place in communities across this country. And then lastly, we must exercise care. How do people demonstrate their care for the space and other people in it is the question you must ask. This is important because we know as transportation engineers, planners, etc., that our field is very male-centric. And in a male-centric field, what you find is that our systems are biased against women. And we also know they don't protect religious minority groups. This is a picture of a young lady. She's a model, but I want to take you to a focus group I was conducting in Portland, Oregon, with a group of Muslim women. I asked the question, how can I get you to bicycle more in Portland? This young lady looked at me and she said, how? The only way, Mr. Brown, you can get me to bicycle more in Portland is you put a gun to my head. That's just how fearful she was of bicycling in one of the most bicycle-friendly cities in all of America. And so it is important that you have this justice framework, that you ask these questions as you're going about your design, your planning, your implementation, etc. But it doesn't stop there. You also got to change the systems in which you work. And you must seek that the system in which you're employed by sort of develops and is encouraged to pursue an anti-racist culture. That means that they start to develop anti-racist values. They should have present a racial equity action plan. Notice I emphasize at racial equity action plan. If you're looking for a great example of one, look at the city of Oakland in terms of what they've done. They must also seek to provide equity trainings, develop equity performance measures, and develop an internal equity working group. But that's not enough. You know, like I know, if everything is internal, there is no accountability. So in order to balance this, you should advocate for an external equity advisory group as well. So now that you have the justice framework to help you think about those who could lack access to what you're doing, you now have the equity strategies to improve things internally. Now let's talk about how you center equity in the transportation decision-making processes, as well as the implementation of active transportation related projects. We're going to talk about racial equity, modal equity, procedural, language, gender, spatial equity, and common sense. The first thing that you must advocate for is a racial equity action plan. You want to advocate for a racial equity action plan because it shows a commitment to equity inside of the organization. It also establishes, as I stated, these equity-based performance measures so you can benchmark progress over time. Secondly, you want to advocate for infrastructure maintenance, especially bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure maintenance in minority and low-income communities. And no, it's not enough to do one project. It's just as important to do maintenance to make sure that that project is sustainable and it is safe over time. Third, you must ensure the full and fair participation of these racialized minority groups. We know in our profession that too often public outreach and engagement is a sort of check the box exercise. It is not enough. If you're serious about racial equity or equity in general, ensure the full and fair participation. And one way that you can do that is ensuring language, equity, and access. So foster a more equitable treatment of these diverse languages in the public sphere. We live in New Jersey, where there are a multitude of different languages that are spoken. It is important that people feel like they have access to your meeting, to your project, by honoring the diversity in these languages. And let's not forget about the elderly and persons with disability. The elderly are overrepresented in traffic fatalities. It is time that we engage with them one-on-one to understand what their barriers and challenges are. We must also make space for and room for and empower or co-power our persons with disabilities. And we must not limit that conversation only to those with physical mobility or disabilities. So what we must do is document and increase their mobility and access. And that starts with the conversation. The same that must take place with women and female-headed households across our area as well. It is important to separately engage with them to deepen our understanding of their behavior and their usage differences. Why? Because we are a male-centric profession, which means that we've already designed our environments in a way in which they are biased against women. So we must correct that. We must do the same for foreign-born populations. We are one of the most diverse states in this country. Therefore, we must engage with our foreign-born populations to understand also their behavior and usage differences. And then we must evaluate and mitigate the unintended consequences of improved mobility and access. You know that once you make these investments, the likelihood is that gentrification and displacement is coming. Or should I say, trees planted in minority communities mature just in time for gentrification to take place. Either way, proactively work to ensure that gentrification and displacement doesn't happen at the level that is happening across this country. One way to continue to address that is through analyzing the impact of past and current zoning and land use decisions. If you believe in structural and institutional racism in America, one of its first tools is zoning. And so with this knowledge, we must continue to analyze its impact so that we can make sure these things are not replicated. And then we must safeguard against discriminatory enforcement, planning, law enforcement, public health, etc. We must work together to ensure that everyone can safely move throughout our places. And then here's some more direct strategies and solutions around arrested mobility. If you're serious, what we need is reparation style infrastructure package for the Black community. And in that reparation style infrastructure package, we need money for bicycle infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, public transit, and public art. We also need and should demand enhanced police accountability. We must work to eliminate the scary Black male narrative. I need to feel safe to jog with a Black hoodie on. So we need a campaign to eliminate this scary Black male narrative. We also need better data that really shows us the Black lives and experiences in a way that is not currently captured in the data. Many of the studies that are done state as a limitation the fact that they didn't properly engage with Black, Indigenous people of color. Why then are we considering the findings to be the gospel? We must talk about that. And we must also advocate for the penalization of race-based 911 calls, because now when you dial 911, it could very well lead to a person of color being killed. We must also eliminate racialized zoning practices, and then we need our white allies to become more courageous. I asked a question on Twitter, why are you silent? And I was speaking to my white brothers and sisters in planning, public health, etc. And many of them stated reasons such as not going against the status quo, the fear of losing their job, etc., etc. We need you to be more courageous because you have a professional obligation to speak about issues that are impacting disproportionately Black and Brown communities. It is your obligation. And then lastly, we all need to increase mental health services throughout this country. This is not just for one population, we're all suffering from this sort of form of trauma. And so I want to end with an understanding. I think it's important to set the ground here. There are many of well-meaning people who come to me and say, we feel your pain. We feel the pain of the Black community. I'm quick to remind them that I understand and I appreciate it. But no, we're not in the same boat. We're in the same storm. There's a huge difference, because as Black people in this country, when you think about arrested mobility, Black people are tired. They can't go jogging. They can't go to the corner store. They can't get Skittles. They can't get a normal traffic ticket. They can't have a disabled vehicle. They can't run. They can't breathe. They can't live. Their mobility has been arrested. I want to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to engaging with you all during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown, for that wonderful talk. So at this point in time, we're going to open up the floor for questions. Feel free to use your clapping hand signals. So using the chat feature beginning now, you can begin to propose questions. and I will call on you to either ask your question. If I hear a period of silence that lasts for roughly 5 seconds, I'll ask your question for you in the spirit of time. And so in the order that they come in, sorry, I'll open up the floor for questions.
Silence is good. So it's a lot to digest there.
So we have our first question coming in from Malembe. Do you want to ask your question, Malembe?
Yes, I can ask my question.
Awesome.
Hi, Professor Brown.
Hello.
You have spoke about how over-policing affect more Black males in the use of public space, and how Black and brown bodies cannot habitate the public space and transport in the same way as other bodies. I was wondering, recognizing that I was also thinking of how women in general, but specifically Black women and trans women, suffer other type of dangers when using the public space. And what are your thoughts on how we can create safe public spaces for Black and brown women bodies and trans women bodies, also in transportation? Because while over policing is the percentage is higher for men, the realities in that intersection of gender is different and should be also tackled.
Yes, that's a great question and a great observation. I prepared over 80 slides, and the one slide that I forgot was the one that I normally include, which is looking at disparities in Black women and trans women as well when it comes to over policing. I think their issues are ignored far too often by people in our profession. And I think that's a major problem. We must do something about that. I care a lot about women, trans women, and all people, and I want to make sure that their concerns are noted. What we can do is have a conversation with them. As a Black male, I'm not qualified to say what the solutions are for Black women and Black trans women, or women, period. What I would like to do in exercising my privilege as a male in society is allow for a space for that conversation to take place, and then to use my privilege to advance whatever it is they need me to advance. Because I don't fully understand, I'm unable to kind of craft research questions, et cetera, to really get at what the root causes are. But I'm open, and I would love for people such as yourself and others to send me those questions so I can incorporate them into my work. And by work, I mean my paid and my unpaid work, because this matters that much to me.
Thank you for that. So if there's more questions hopefully coming in soon, we'll wait a few minutes. All right, we have a question from Jack D that just came in. Jack, did you want to ask your question, or would you like me to read it? Okay, I will ask the question on behalf of Jack. Jack says, it would appear that establishing bike lanes and facilities in cities in New Jersey, whether painted or hardened lanes, has been slower here compared to, say, New York City. What do you think slows their development here?
Well, first and foremost is that we don't want to make a sort of apple to orange comparison. And what I mean by that is New York City is a city. New Jersey is an entire state, is led by, different administrations at the local, the county, and the regional level. We do have some very progressive cities, and some of which are just as progressive as New York right now, such as the city of Hoboken, the city of Jersey City. These are places where I think it's debatable. I really do think that they are moving just as quickly as New York has moved. And we are soon to forget that it took New York City a very long time to get where it's at. And many people feel that New York City is headed backwards, that it is starting to reverse many of the accomplishments that it had in place under the current administration and others. So we do have I would say, growth and maturity among cities here, but it does take time. I don't believe that overnight we're going to see it happen throughout all of New Jersey. That's just not how things work. What we have to do is be more patient. And what we have to do also is celebrate those who are doing great work. For instance, I host through the New Jersey Department of Transportation a biannual Complete Street Summit where we invite planners, engineers, public officials, others throughout the country, and not throughout the country, throughout the state for a meeting. And we celebrate places like Jersey City, Hoboken, New Brunswick, Ocean City, and others, Camden, New Jersey, who are doing a great job. So let's find a way to tell those stories so it doesn't appear that New York City is outpacing everyone else.
Thank you. Our next question comes in from Marilyn Correa. Marilyn, did you want to ask your question and unmute yourself?
I can.
Awesome.
You guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I asked, you showed a lot of examples of different cities where the obviously different races are living in different sections clumped together. As architects, do you think our ultimate plan is to start in combining these different races, or to kind of leave them separate and try to better the lower impact, like lower income areas, and try to make them better?
I think as architects, you are to approach your profession with people in mind. And if you center people in your profession, what you're going to find or discover is that those maps that I showed you, they are a reflection of someone's decision or a group's decision. So everything I showed you was by design. And if segregation is a result of design, then we can integrate by design as well. And so as an architect, I need you and your colleagues to understand that you have that power to push for integration of neighborhoods, to push for affordable housing, to push for a diversity in housing options, and to always design not for profit, but for people. Now, I'm not ignorant. I understand that profit is important, but I think there are ways to partner and collaborate with people that will reduce the cost that you may have to do what you want to do in an effective and efficient way. The point of tonight's presentation is to get you as architects to see people before you see property.
Thank you. Our next question comes in from Veronica Foster of Nashville. Veronica, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, so I am tuning in from Nashville, and thank you so much, Professor Brown, for giving such a great talk. I'm with the Civic Design Center, so we're doing a lot of work in community engagement, as well as connecting as a liaison between municipalities and architects and the community. And one of the big questions I've been having, especially in COVID, is how do we start to make community engagement just more accessible in general, whether that's social media advertising to get surveys out there, to host the entire community engagement session on a virtual platform. We've already started to kind of, dip our toes into that, but I just kind of wondered how you feel about that. Is it truly accessible? That is another question.
By it, you meaning social media?
Just like social media advertising to kind of drive more community engagement, whether that's in person or potentially a digitally hosted community engagement session.
Right. So just so I state my position firmly on community outreach and engagement, I think in a more ideal world, you always go where the people are, number one. So meet people where they are. Given that you have contextualized your question within the challenges around COVID, I am not opposed to social media advertising, especially via Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and other places where you could do it and do it well. The reason being is because it gives you the power to target the groups that you are looking to target. Of course, the naysayers would say and think rightfully, well, there's a lack of internet access, social media access, et cetera. That is true. But there are also over, I think, a couple 100 million people on Facebook. So if you do it and you do it well, there is an opportunity for you to probably be even more effective in your engagement and outreach due to the fact that you're able to target these individuals. It isn't the most ideal way to do it, but given the challenges around COVID, it makes it safer and it gives you the ability to target. So I think you're on the right path there. I'm a fan of it. Just please don't have pictures of only white people in your ads when you're trying to target Black and brown people. And I'm sure you know that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And also, if there's background noise on my end, I apologize. I live on a busy street, not too far from Bloustein.
It's okay, Johnny.
Our next question comes in from Patricia. Patricia, did you want to ask your question? I'll wait 5 seconds. Okay, so I'm gonna ask it on your behalf. Patricia says, what do you think about the gender separated cars in the metro lines of Mexico City? Is this a strategy to replicate in other places, and until when?
I love it. I love it considering, the gender-based violence that happens against women in public transportation or in public space in general, period. This is something that is of interest to me. I'm currently teaming with, and I'm gonna mess this up, the Center for Global Women Leadership, I think is the name. We are interested in that topic and we're doing some work around it. And the Mexico City case was one of the examples in which we looked to for guidance on ways to sort of address and eliminate gender-based violence. And so I think other places should replicate it. However, the jury is still out on how successful it is in terms of reducing this sort of violence, but I certainly love it as a strategy. And I believe it is a strategy in which was birthed by the women who were experiencing the violence. And so for that very reason alone, I think it's one that should be celebrated, advocated for, and recommended. So yes, I'm a huge fan.
Thank you. Our next question comes in from Robin. Robin, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, I can ask my question. You can hear me okay. Hi.
Hi, Robin.
So my question is, what do you think, what is your take on or what do you think about the idea of the sort of 15-minute neighborhood, the mixed use neighborhoods? It's not really an old, it's a new old idea as a way to get rid of the traditional centers for work that would then create more equity amongst people living in, especially in New York City where I live, the 5 boroughs.
Yeah, so I like it in terms of potentially increasing access to, the things that we need and we can enjoy within 15 minutes, of course. I like it from that standpoint. I like it in terms of how it could positively lead to, improvements in the climate and the environment, because people don't have to travel as far or use the modes that would be most damaging to our environment. We still don't know in terms of how it's going to be policed. And so when you think about the 15-minute neighborhoods, I don't think the creation of them or the promotion of them are going to lead to a reduction in Black and brown people's mobility being arrested, because it takes things beyond just design to address that issue. So if you're looking for, is it a great concept for increasing mobility, increasing or reducing social isolation, improving health, improving the environment? Yes. Will it change the fact that people's mobility has been arrested? To be determined. Because there are many places in New York City and elsewhere around the country right now that are 15-minute neighborhoods, and policing or over-policing is still very dominant. And because everyone is probably going to be trying to get within this ecosystem of a 15-minute neighborhood, the dominant society is going to dictate the behavior and the practices within that neighborhood, and that concerns me.
What do you mean by who are you describing as the dominant?
The dominant culture in America right now is the white culture. That is not an opinion, that's a fact.
I would like to add a male culture to that, because it's not what women do not dominate. In my opinion, but I think it's a fact as well.
We could certainly have that conversation. I wouldn't feel comfortable having that conversation during this recording, but I don't disagree.
Thank you.
I just don't fully agree.
All right, well, thank you for that question and that answer. And so right now we don't have any other questions. We have some comments, so I do want to open the floor for anyone who did want to ask a question that maybe I glossed over inadvertently. So I'll wait a couple seconds.
You're doing a great job, Jenny.
Thank you. And then if not, I'll ask a question. Oh, we have a question that came in from Lily. Lily, did you want to ask your question, or would you like me to ask it?
Sure, yeah, I can ask the question.
Awesome, thanks.
So in what ways, if any, has the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated like racial transportation issues like arrested mobility?
So one of the ways in which it has done it is when you look at public transit use, there have been cuts to services across America. And the people that are most dependent on this public transit are, people, racialized minority groups in this country and low-income populations. That's one way. Another way is that many cities, right when COVID happened, they removed their e-scooters, their bike share systems, which was starting to become the lifeline for many of these communities as well. Also, when you look at going back to transit, the data from some of these cities is showing that even though there was a COVID-19 impact on all of transit use, the people that were still using it almost to the same degree were the racialized minority groups. Why is that? Because they're the ones who are truly dependent upon it. For everyone else, it's a luxury. For them, it's a necessity. And so when we think about COVID, as we arrest your consciousness right now, it's important that when you look at what is happening during this time, who truly needs what transportation service or option? And when we design for the future, we should design with those who are most in need in mind, not designing to ensure that those with the most access to resources and wealth in this country have first dibs at our transportation options. So what it has revealed in summary, again, is who needs it the most. And so hopefully we change our behavior, we change our plans and strategies moving forward to ensure that those most in need gain access.
Thank you. So we're still waiting on some more questions to come in.
Thank you, Lily.
If none come in maybe
Go ahead, Johnny. Ask your question, man. Go
Okay.
ahead. All right.
My question is really more advice. So today we, I think, have seen, especially with regard to social media, sharing of information, we've seen kind of our democracy, I think, be attacked by sharing of disinformation deliberately.
Excuse me, did you say our democracy or our republic? Which one did you say?
I'd said our democracy, but I guess in parentheses, I mean our republic in actuality. But we do see our democratic values being attacked, especially our election processes and things like that. I just was wondering, because, you know, I'm one of those people often engaging with folks who have different opinions than mine. When you see folks talking about this, you know, spreading information that's patently false, do you have any sort of advice for how we engage with those sorts of individuals and how we enlighten them, if you will?
Engaging with people who are purposely spreading false information?
I don't want to say purposefully, but maybe inadvertently.
Or out of ignorance?
I would like to think so in many cases, out of ignorance.
All right, so let's break it into two categories: those who are willingly doing it without any care or concern, and those who don't know any better. For those who are willingly doing it, I would just simply say, don't waste your time and energy engaging with those people. They have a purpose. You engaging with them, I doubt, will lead to them changing their position. For those who are doing it out of ignorance, I think we have a duty to engage them with empathy, with love and care, and to try and provide them with new information so that they can make better decisions and then they can share the truth. I think that's where your energy is best spent. And ideally, yeah, I'll stop there. That's where your energy is best spent.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have a question for you all. Why do you think the arrested mobility is such an issue in the planning space? Why do you think this feels, why is this such an issue? No, let me change my question. Why don't we have more conversations like this in planning? What do you think is preventing us from having more of these conversations? Go ahead, Robin.
Well, I think it's what you said, because the dominant culture doesn't care about these issues and we're not thinking about access for all.
Why is that so?
Well, when you provide access for all, then you're getting closer to an equitable society, and people don't want that who have power.
Do rising tides lift all boats?
Say that again?
Do rising tides lift all boats?
Do rising tides lift all
boats or ships?
Well, yes, don't they?
Only if we were in the, we are in the same, we're in a different storm, right? What is it? Same storm, different, yeah. Thank you for that, Robin.
Let me ask you can I ask you a question? Another question?
Absolutely.
I just was on a seminar today through the 9th Section Y, and the acting chair of the transportation committee for DC or whatever it is was talking about the need for, she believed in free public transportation, but they don't have, of course, the money to support that. Do you think a free public transportation network would help with some of the issues you're talking about?
Absolutely. I think LA Metro also just recently is providing free transportation. I don't like the term free, because then people are gonna, have reasons to attack it. We're just not charging people to use public transportation. I prefer they say something like that because it becomes politicized. But we all know that we are heavily subsidizing automobile travel in this country. Single occupancy vehicles are heavily subsidized. For some reason, those conversations are not making the news in the same way conversations about free transit would. So the media is a concern here. We need more balanced media and discussion because that unfortunately is helping to perpetuate many of the issues that we're facing.
Thank you. We have another comment from Veronica in response to your question. It says, privileged folks are uncomfortable to talk about something that isn't affecting them. Certainly think that's true.
Is that true, Johnny? Is that true, Veronica? Because I believe that I am because we are. And if you believe that, what happens to me happens to you. Maybe not directly, but indirectly. And so that goes back to your question, Johnny, about what we do in terms of how we engage with the people who are acting because they have a ulterior sort of a purpose or motive that is not equitable or not just or fair versus those acting out of ignorance. We got to start letting people understand that we're all in this together. This is a together thing. If you arrest my mobility, not soon, but soon, your mobility may be arrested as well. If you know the history of this country, many of my white brothers and sisters not long ago were not considered white. They were considered Irish, they were considered Italian, they were considered Polish, they were considered Jewish and other sort of ethnic groups. What if we return to those days? We should look out for each other because we are a human race and we should care about our neighbors the same way we care about everything else. So don't let them arrest my mobility because they may be coming for yours.
Indeed. Any other comments from folks?
I think a lot of it too has to do with the individualism and how people function throughout society in this country, because we don't think about everyone as a whole. It's always me. What am I doing? What can benefit myself, my family? We're not thinking about everyone when we make decisions. We're primarily thinking about who I am and other people that look like me that are going to benefit from this.
You're right, Jasmine. Yeah, certainly. All right, Jenny, you want to tell us when they got time for one last question?
Sure. So does anyone want to have one more question before we sign off here? Okay. Any of our e-board members have any questions? I can end on.
I have a question based off one of the questions that was asked before about the gender, the different gender lines, but is that just male, female? That's not inclusive of all genders. And if they divide it like that, people may be on the male gendered side, but then the certain males on that I see that person as a male, and then they'll be discriminated against in a space they're supposed to feel comfortable.
You're going back to the Mexico City example?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I want to state that when we think about gender-based violence against women, we're thinking about all of those who identify as women. So that's the clarification there. Great observation.
6 p.m.
I'll ask one more question, actually. So before COVID, when we used to meet in person and when we would do community outreach for projects and changing aspects of our community that we live in. And this is something that I've encountered in the work that I do. I see a lot, you get something that's referred to as a feedback loop. You get the same folks showing up all the time talking. And while these folks might be opinion leaders in their own communities, in a lot of cases, you're not accessing all of the individuals who live in that community. And so you're not seeing the full picture. So with regard to changing our public environment and projects that we engage in, how do you address the feedback loop? What are some mechanisms that we can use to make sure that we reach all of the folks, in public forums?
Well, I think it's extremely hard to reach all the people, right? I mean, that's the ideal scenario, but it's extremely hard. It's extremely expensive to do so. But for those that do show up and we engage, we owe it to them to consistently inform them of progress on a project or a plan. And this could be done either in person or virtually, or by phone or by email. But the main thing is to not go into a community, ask questions of them, then abandon them. I feel very strongly about becoming a quote unquote citizen of that community, where I not only go there to ask questions, but I also go there to invest in the community by spending my money, my time, my resources, etc., in that community. So every single community I've engaged with, I try to make sure I answer my phone, my email, or text when they call me. And whenever I'm privy to some information that may benefit them financially, I share those resources as well. So again, this is about really caring for people and places, and you show that you care through your actions. So if they only see you once every project, you're not being authentic. What you're doing is you're sort of taking advantage of them. And that's not something we promote.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, with that said, I think we'll, if there's no more questions or comments, I think we'll wrap this up.
I have one final comment, Johnny. I want to again thank all of you. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I do not have all of the answers, but I'm willing to collaborate with each of you to find the answers. I am in no way perfect, but I'm comfortable so far in my imperfections because I know I'm trying to find that perfection that we're all seeking. Let's build together. Let's work together. I'm here. I answer my emails. I answer my Twitter messages, my phone calls, etc. Reach out to me. Let's build together. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And with that said, huge thank you to Professor Brown for that wonderful talk tonight. I look forward to working together and building together and creating solutions together. We look forward to extending those opportunities to each one of you who joined us tonight. And to those of you who registered who couldn't come, for your friends, we will be releasing this recording to everyone by this weekend. I have a little bit of editing ahead of me that I'll take care of with my colleagues. And so I want to thank our faculty advisors, Professor Juan Ayala, Professor Paul Drake, and Professor Barbara Fega for your support and assistance in all of this. Thank you so much. And once again, Professor Brown, thank you so much. Everyone take care and have a great night.
Take care.